There's a famous quote to Robert Solow, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. I actually just read it somewhere in the last 24 hours. He said, "I've got a terrible trade deficit with my barber. He never buys anything from me, and I'm buying stuff regularly from him."
Somebody had to do it. They had to stop because it was not sustainable.
Is the US being ripped off? Now, when I'm trying to get my head around a difficult economic issue, I usually go and pick Evan's brains. So we brought Evan into the studio, and I had a chat with him.
What a pleasure to be here.
It's an absolute...
And it's a really interesting topic. And what do we mean by has a nation been ripped off? Because there clearly are ways. Sarah, the most obvious is, of course, America spends a lot more on defence than everybody else, and we've all sat under the American defence umbrella. So I think you can sort of see what Donald Trump means.
They've been carrying an unfair share of the load.
Yeah, they've been paying more, and we've been enjoying the benefit. I'll tell you another area I think unquestionably the Americans have been ripped off is pharmaceutical prices, right? Where everybody in the world benefits from the research and development that the drug companies do to make the new drugs. They pay a lot more for those drugs than we do. We're basically we're getting the benefit of a lot of what the Americans pay for those drugs. That finances the R&D. We then get the drugs relatively cheaply and all the benefits from. So look, there definitely are ways in which that country can say, as the top nation, we get ripped off.
OK, but as far as tariffs are concerned, because this is where we are now, suddenly in a global trade war, when you look back at, and let's just take US-China, when you look back at the trade deficit over time, we're now talking between the two of it's nearly $300 billion US dollars. And it's a number, when you look back at the history, that really started ratcheting up after 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization.
Yeah. So China became engaged with the global economy, unlike the decades before, was part of the rules-based system, entered the WTO, and what China did was become the manufacturing nation, and we outsourced a lot of manufacturing. The US did. Everybody did, put it there. And the Chinese then exported manufactured goods, and most of us were in the market for those goods. So yes, and we ran a big trade deficit.
You can see some obvious reasons why that would happen. If it's cheaper to make something somewhere, you would go there if you were devising your supply chains. But there is something else, Evan, which is that the US does consistently have lower tariffs on other people than they have on it.
Right. So on the tariff point, yes, the US has been a lower tariff nation than most other nations. And there have been some nations with really quite a lot of rigid import controls, tariff or otherwise. Personally, when you actually look at the tariff figures, EU versus US, it's complicated because you have tariffs on some things, not others. I think you'll find that the US tariffs on the EU are something of the order of 2% on average, weighted for different product ranges. The EU ones will be 3-4%. You're talking about quite small numbers. I don't believe tariffs are what have driven these great flows in global trade. What has driven trade, manufacturing to China, has driven it out of the UK to China, has driven it out of the US to China, and that has been China's willingness to make stuff, to make it very efficiently and to make it very cheaply, and that's what's really driven it.
Okay, so is the argument that even if it really was a level playing field on tariffs, that arguably there you might be able to reduce the huge trade deficit, but not by very much?
Yeah, exactly, not very much. And the thing is, a really important thing is that you shouldn't judge whether you're being ripped off by that nation or the other nation by whether you have a trade deficit with that nation or the other nation. And there's a famous quote to Robert Solow, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. I actually just read it somewhere in the last 24 hours. He said, "I've got a terrible trade deficit with my barber. He never buys anything from me, and I'm buying stuff regularly from him." And the reason he doesn't buy from you is that it's better for Robert Solow to sell his services to a university or something like that, and then spend his money at the barber. And it has been better for the United States, for example, I mean, we can talk about the more complicated effect of this, but it has been felt by the United States in its actions better to put the manufacturing in China or latterly Vietnam, and we in the West or in the United States or UK specialise in other things that are maybe more valuable and more wonderful than producing shoes or the like.
Okay, which is why when you start including services, everything we've been talking about is just goods. When you start including services, it sort of doesn't, it's not such a serious deficit. There was a fascinating thing I came across the other day. Chinese households saved more than 30% of their disposable income on average. 7% in the US. I mean, basically, the US like to spend.
Right. Well, you see, that is, I think, another reason why I don't think the trade deficit reflects tariffs. It reflects kind of decisions made by businesses and others about where to put stuff. The US has been a rich economy, so it doesn't look like it's being ripped off by Lesotho or by Indonesia or even by China. These are much poorer countries than the United States. So sort of they are one of the richest countries in the world, so they've obviously got
it's a good
something.
deal. If you want to buy diamonds from Lesotho, isn't that great? You can.
The other thing, I think you really have to focus on this, is that often the big trade flows with respect to the rest of the world. A country that has a trade deficit with the rest of the world, that is reflecting savings and spending. So if you're a country that doesn't save and spends, you will tend to be sucking in imports. And a country that saves like crazy, like Japan, which for reasons we can go into another time, which saves like crazy, they will tend to be exporting. Exporting can almost be seen as a form of saving. You're sending something overseas, getting money for it, stocking it in your bank, and then that's like a form of saving. So that's another way of looking at it.
There is something that I have been wrestling with and really struggling to get my head around, which is partly the consequences of this having a large trade deficit like the US has. Because doesn't it mean that other countries are holding US dollars because they are buying things priced in dollars, and that is propping up the dollar? And if you prop up the dollar, then it is good news for the US. And you're raising your eyebrows.
No.
Have I gone wrong there?
No, you're all right. Yeah.
Okay. Also, they're buying US treasuries, which is keeping borrowing low for the US.
Keeping the borrowing rates low, so they can borrow, So there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in what you said, and yes, it's very true. So if you're a small, normal country like us, if you run a big trade deficit, here's what should happen. You're trying to buy lots of foreign currency to buy or pay for those imports, and they're not buying any of your currency to buy your goods. So your currency goes down, you devalue your currency, and everything becomes more expensive to buy overseas. And that's kind of like nature's way of telling you you're running a trade deficit. So if you're a small country, ordinary country, usually you devalue your currency when you're running a big trade deficit.
And can I just put in a brackets in there? And of course, if you're wanting to export, that's good because what you've got becomes cheaper.
That's the market's way or nature's way of telling you export more, import less, because the imported goods are becoming more expensive. Now, if you're the United States, your top nation, and your currency has a kind of special status, which economies call reserve currency status, it's very different, because when you run a trade deficit, other countries don't say, I don't need dollars, I'm not buying anything from the US, I don't want these dollars. Other countries say, we actually really quite like having dollars in our central bank vaults. We just want dollars anyway to hold because it's a nice currency, it looks good, it's pretty stable, you kind of know where it's going to be in 10 years' time. It's a bit like gold, And so essentially, the devaluation that you might expect to occur in an ordinary country if they ran trade deficits year after year doesn't occur in the United States. So, now, is that then being ripped off? No, that's just like other countries are indulging your trade deficit in a way that smaller countries wouldn't get away with.
But doesn't this lead us to a potentially interesting consequence of this? And I know we have some way to go, but it's a slightly be careful what you wish for. Because if you reduce the US trade deficit, and if the dollar falls, as we have seen it doing, if US treasuries fall, suddenly you're a bit like, every other country who's going to have to pay more.
Yeah, exactly.
And pay more to borrow.
So the point is the US has been enjoying what Donald Trump calls a rip-off position is also possibly framed as a luxury position, that the rest of the world has indulged the American low level of savings, indulged their desire to run a trade deficit, has made it very easy for them to offshore their manufacturing. And has made Americans rich. I mean, it's made them rich because they're consuming a lot, and everyone's indulged them on that. And so be careful what you wish for, because take that away, let the dollar fall, you'll be paying more for those imports rather than less, you'll be poorer rather than richer.
Except you said has made Americans rich. It hasn't made all Americans rich. And there is a group of people who, and in fact Larry Fink, BlackRock CEO, made the point about this, is as a result of globalisation, it created a flatter world, lifted, he said, 1 billion people out of $1-a-day poverty, but it also held back millions in wealthier nations striving for a better life. And those are the people that President Trump says have been betrayed by by everybody, including previous US presidents.
And that, I think, is probably the best way of looking at a rationale for what you might call this American slash and burn approach to ending globalization and bringing the curtains down on an era of kind of trade liberalization. It's not about the US versus other countries. It's about a group of people in the US versus other people in the US. So it's more about the internal dynamics of the United States. If you wanted to help Rust Belt workers whose factories have been taken away and who've lost their jobs, or the unemployment is high in the Rust Belt. It's not 50%. But there are high rates of unemployment. The other jobs are not as well paid as the old factory jobs, unionized factory jobs that the workers maybe enjoyed. If you want to help those workers, and you don't mind hurting Hollywood and all the service exporters who've been enjoying wonderful decades as a dominant American industry. This kind of pulling the plug on globalization might be a way to do it, because you might be making the exports, the imports more expensive for your Hollywood industry to buy, but you might be making the industrial chances of those Rust Belt workers somewhat better. So it's kind of like an internal thing.
Which is why you can find economists who are in favour of the idea of it, not the slash and burn way that it's happening, the shock and awe, but they just like the idea that one could be moving towards a system that protected certain US workers.
And I think I think it is valid to look at it that way. And so, I tend to think
they have been ripped off. Arguably,
exactly. I think it doesn't make sense to say the US has been ripped off by China. Look at the trade deficit. I don't think that makes sense. That's back to my barber. Never buys anything from me. I don't think it makes sense to look at the overall trade deficit as a rip-off of the United States. I think that's more the world indulging America's desire to spend. I think it is possible to say that within the United States, there are people who've been very hard done by the macro trends of the last few decades, and who haven't really had much luck on their side in the world economy. And the US absorbs these shocks by making groups of people poorer or expecting them to move out of their state and find jobs elsewhere. Maybe the US is better at some of those adjustments than others. But I think it is definitely fair to say that there are people, not just in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, France, Italy, all over, who've seen the rug pulled from under them in the world economy. And globalization has maybe been a net loss.
So if the result of this is that people relocate, for example, manufacturing to the US, it will benefit them.
Not necessarily. So I don't think you can assume that because you might have a narrative that says these macro trends haven't worked for groups of people, that there's much you can do to make it better. Because my guess is if clothes manufacturing comes back to the US, it's going to be very automated. And indeed, even I think some administration economists have said it's going to be automated. And I just don't think you can assume.
But won't it be bringing wealth back into certain areas, even if it isn't the number of jobs that it used to be?
You just don't know if the factories will even be in those places. I mean, the economy isn't going to go back to where it was in the 1970s. It's going to go forwards to something where it might be in the 2030s. And if it involves more manufacturing, it doesn't mean it involves more like those old factory jobs that the workers had, because the world has changed, the technology's changed. So I don't know, even if you share the view that you've had a group of people who've had the rug pulled from under them, I don't think you can assume that it works for them just to say you can't buy. You now, even you in the Rust Belt, are going to pay more for your shoes, cars, T-shirts, whatever.
And not necessarily get the job.
Yeah, because you may get the losses of the tariffs without getting the benefits.